Just help me understand, just to begin with, how the incoming data is informing the decision that you're making around fiscal stimulus and the package you're set to deliver down in DC.
Well, the numbers that we got this morning really do underscore the cost of inaction. The January numbers are quite disappointing. They show that the pace of job growth is slow. It's certainly over the past 3 months, it's a lot slower than it was earlier at the end of 2020. And it underscores that without further aid, our economy is going to continue to struggle. We need to get that aid out to the families and businesses that need it. We need to make sure that we spend the resources we need to contain the virus so that we can all get back to work. And this report really does make that quite clear.
Heather, you use that word aid, but given the size of the package, some people would just call it stimulus. It's huge. Why is that word aid different to the word stimulus? And why do you think it's aid and not stimulus?
Well, at this point in this crisis, our first goal is to contain the pandemic. So a lot of the funds that are in the American Rescue Plan are about making sure that schools can reopen, making sure that we get the vaccine out, making sure that all the things we need to do to keep Americans safe and healthy are our first priority. And while we do that, we need to make sure that businesses have the resources they need, and importantly, families have the resources they need so they can weather this crisis. So it still is, we're still really thinking about this as relief until we can contain the virus.
Larry Summers is in the Washington Post today asking some important questions about the size of this package relative to the output gap. Heather, could you weigh in on that, if at all? What the right size of the package should be relative to the output gap that we need to fill?
Certainly. You know, this package was built from the ground up. We looked at the needs all across our economy and calculated how much it was that we were going to need to spend to, again, to contain the virus, to make sure that schools could reopen, to make sure that childcare centers can reopen, to make sure that workers have paid leave, all of those sorts of things. And then to make sure that workers have those unemployment benefits as long as they need them, those direct checks for all the families that need them. So we built that in that way. And, you know, the goal here is to make sure that, you know, families and businesses can weather this crisis. And we'll worry, you know, it may be that this report from January really does show that the high unemployment, especially for communities of color, the job losses for women, and the lower labor force participation really do show that we need to continue to act, and we need to do so quickly.
Heather, what happens if everything goes right? That's the question that Larry Summers, I think, is asking. What's the contingency plan if everything starts to go right and maybe too right?
Well, you know, 2020 was a really rough year, and we know that we have a hard time predicting the shape of this pandemic. And we know that without aid, families and businesses suffer. And today's jobs report really is the proof of the proof is in the pudding here, that without continued support, we're going to see an economy that is performing much more worse than it needs to be. So I am, quite frankly, far more worried about the costs of inaction than I am of doing too much at this point.
I think that echoes what many people are talking about down in DC at the moment on both the monetary policy side and the fiscal side in this administration. Heather, let's get to one of the policies, the checks. If I earn $75,000 and I can get a big check from the US government, why is that aid and not stimulus?
Well, that is a great question. So here's the thing. You know, we saw the checks were an incredibly effective tool when they went out last spring. Families used them. They helped them, you know, when they experienced unemployment or added expenses because of the crisis. And we know that millions of families are struggling right now. And that is the purpose of topping up the checks from December to get that $2,000 out there to all the families that need them.
Talk to me about eligibility and the conversation within the administration at the moment. Heather, is there some concern that maybe the pool of people that could receive these checks is just a little bit too wide?
Well, you know, the president has been very clear that getting those checks that total $2,000 out to families is his priority, and he's been open to negotiation on the margins. But, you know, I think what's really important is that, you know, all those kindergarten teachers, those firefighters, those folks who were pulling in, you know, $60,000 or so, that they get this aid. We have seen how important it is that those checks get out there and provide those cushions for families.
They still have jobs, though, Heather. And I'm not here to advocate either side of this debate. I'm just trying to understand this just a little bit more, because The word I keep hearing down in DC is bipartisan, but this seems to be very ideological. The idea of trying to address some of the social injustices of the last several decades, maybe even longer, and not to relieve people from the effects of the pandemic. There's pandemic relief and then there's relief because of injustice or perceived injustice of the last decades, several decades in this country. Heather, which one is it?
You know, I think that this is about relief, but it is also about the fact that we are in a K-shaped recovery. You know, continues to be the case that folks at the top end of the income distribution have done very well. Those folks that have been able to telecommute safely, you know, at the very, very top. And as you started this segment, folks, you know, who are in the stock market have seen record highs. But the reality is, for millions of families who are not in those top echelons, this has been an incredibly stressful and economically damaging time. So we need to make sure to get relief out there. You know, we need to make sure that those essential workers get that relief. We need to make sure that families who are struggling have the support they need.
Do you think it should be based on regions and the cost of living in those regions? Do you think one check for everyone, regardless of where they live, makes sense?
Well, you know, we're a big country, and certainly economic conditions are different across the country, but we are one country. And this is a federal policy to make sure that we're providing that support that we need to people all across these United States. So that seems like the right policy for this moment.